Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 38th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name's Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by JMU Sports News co creator Jack Fitzpatrick. Jack, it's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. I'm pumped for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Really appreciate you coming on, obviously. And, let's get right into it. I just want to start by asking when you first knew that you wanted to work in the sports industry.
I think it happened pretty early on. I
Mhm.
was a sports writer in high school, covering kind of high school football and the sports around all of that.
Yeah.
I realized quickly on that I was not good at sports. I was not blessed with an athletic gene. So instead of being part of it in that sense, I kind of transitioned and decided that I wanted to kind of move over into the media side of it all. And
Mhm.
I kind of quickly realized that I really enjoyed the journalism aspect of it. And that's kind of where then when I went to JMU, tailored my classes. I was a SMAD major and kind of went on that route.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned during the intro, you are a co creator of JMU Sports News, which is both a podcast and a publication focusing on all things related to JMU sports. At what point did both you and Bennett Conlon, the other co creator, decide that you wanted to start this project?
Yeah, I think it was in about 2018 or so. I was a
Mhm.
senior, rising senior, I think it was, going into my last year at JMU. Bennett was a year above me, so he had graduated out, and he kind of reached out to me about this thing that he still wanted to be following JMU and covering JMU athletics and kind of a fan analyst type of way. So we called ourselves Fanalists, and we dove into it that way and started doing JMU Sports News. Quickly created the podcast to go along with it. I mean, the different iterations we've had of JMU Sports News since creating it back in 2018. We've been a newsletter. We then focused more on the writing side of it. Then we focused more on the podcast and digital side of it. And yeah, it's taken us to where we are today, where we cover JMU. We have a blast doing it. We have the weekly podcast, and it's just an excuse, talk to a good friend an hour, 2 hours every week about JMU and about other things happening in life. So it's an absolute blast.
Yeah, love to hear it. And in a recent tweet, you described JMU Sports News as a passion project that began, as you just mentioned, around 2018. Did you ever expect the kind of growth that it's gotten over the past few years, both the podcast and the articles?
I don't think so. I mean, when
Mhm.
it started, it was maybe 4 listens on a podcast and, 5 or 6 listens or views on our articles, and we just kind of were doing it as a way to talk about it. We stuck with it,
Mhm.
we continued doing it, and, now over 10,000 followers on Jamie Sports News proper. We have our Dukes Recruits kind of, vertical as well, where we talk more JMU football recruiting, basketball
Yeah.
recruiting, and people, like, reach out to us and say they enjoy the podcast and they use our trackers for information that we have. Mainly those are just done for us, so we have some sort of reference, so we know what we're talking about. So it's cool to see that other people have taken an interest in what we love doing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I write articles about JMU football. I interview some players, and I will say I watch a lot of your guys' videos, read a lot of articles. Really do love the work that you're putting out there. And
Dope.
recently you got a role on 106.1 FM as a co-host of the Sports Huddle with Black and Jack. Can you just break down how this opportunity came to be?
Yeah, I mean, it was just kind of grinding away. I started as a producer. Well, I lived in Charlotte the last 3 years. I was a social media manager for a sports book. Things happened, and I ended up finding my way up to Richmond, living with my girlfriend now. And when I moved up here, I kind of had the opportunity to dive headfirst into producing for ESPN Richmond up here. And then as time went on, about 6, 7 months or so, I was kind of pestering the program director, wanting to be a host, and getting the opportunities behind the mic. And eventually I got that opportunity, and it's been kind of a slow launch with that, just because February I've been traveling with ODU men's basketball
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
Virginia Union basketball and doing a bunch of stuff like that. So I haven't been able to do it full time, but once kind of this crazy February rolls down, it'll be quite a fun time over there at ESPN Richmond.
Yeah, and as I just stated, you are a radio host as well as a podcaster, journalist, and a play-by-play broadcaster around the Richmond, Virginia area. How much do you value versatility in your work and being able to thrive in all these different areas?
Yeah, I think you kind of have to.
Mhm.
With being a play-by-play, most play-by-plays also do hosting on, radio shows, and that is kind of coming with the field, I guess. So if you
Mhm.
do play-by-play, typically you're going to have to be doing all of these other things. And as much as we love sports, as much as we love talking about sports and working in sports, sometimes it just doesn't pay the same way that
Yeah.
other jobs do. So you kind of have to have that versatility
Mhm.
to have multiple revenue streams and multiple opportunities to be bringing in money because uh, just sticking to one may not be enough to pay the bills.
Yeah, and transitioning over to some JMU football, where Colin Hitchler was recently hired as the new defensive coordinator. Hitchler previously spent time with schools such as Alabama, Wisconsin, and Cincinnati, and was on the same coaching staff as Bob Chesney in 2011 at Salve Regina University. We'll dive into it a little bit more, but just baseline, what's your thoughts on this hiring?
I think it's a fantastic
Mhm.
hire. We've seen that Chesney at times is kind of wanting to stay within his close circle, bringing over Dean
Mhm.
Kennedy from
Yeah.
Holy Cross last year, Chris Smith, an offensive line coach. When they lost their strength and conditioning coach, he brought in his Holy Cross strength and conditioning coach this
Mhm.
offseason.
Yeah.
So there was kind of that thought that the defensive coordinator, Lyle Hemphill, went to Texas A&M. Was he going to bring in another Holy Cross guy? Personally, I didn't really want that because I think it's beneficial to have outside voices and outside opinions that kind of go outside of your circle, bringing that into your circle so you have different viewpoints. And that's exactly what he did. Granted, you said it, Hitchler does have some experience with Chesney back at Salve
Yeah.
Regina, but that was so long ago, and both of the coaches have just kind of completely revamped what they were doing from back then. So Hitchler comes in with experience working with Luke Fickell for his years at Cincinnati, a year at Wisconsin, got that experience in the SEC at Alabama. Um, it feels like a heist. It feels like an insane get to get this SEC, Big 10, Big 12 uh, quality defensive coordinator into JMU. Probably won't last long. It would probably be kind of like a Lyle Hemphill type of situation where he's
Yeah.
going to stick around for a year or two, probably more on a year. But I think it's a fantastic hire for this next 365 days that we'll have him.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the hiring too. It's also important to note that 24/7 Sports named Hitchler the 18th best recruiter in the 2024 class. As you mentioned, he's worked with Luke Fickell, Marcus Freeman, a lot of great coaches. And
Yeah.
Hitchler was obviously a safeties coach at both Cincinnati and Wisconsin, and a defensive backs coach at Alabama. Throughout his career, he's worked with NFL players such as Brian Cook, Derek Forrest, Jeremy Reeves. How do you think Hitchler's experience with the safety position will help benefit guys like Jacob Thomas, Curtis Harris Lopez this upcoming season?
I think it'll be huge. I
Mhm.
also like that Hemphill was the Nichols coach, so it's not too huge of a difference where your
Yeah.
defensive coordinator
Mhm.
a year ago is working with defensive backs. Now your defensive coordinator this year likely will also be the defensive backs coach.
Mhm.
And not only the two you mentioned, but Chauncey Logan, all of the corners, all of the defensive backs. See how he's able to kind of raise them up because at times they were really good last year. At times they left a little bit
Mhm.
to be desired. So I think him coming in is going to be really interesting to see how he implements what he does. The emphasis for Lyle Hemphill was forcing turnovers. I think he hated calling them turnovers. I think he preferred him call them takeaways because he liked the active verb of taking the
Mhm.
ball away. But that's what Hemphill loved, and it'll be interesting to see if how Hitchler trains him. Does he kind of have the same focus for the defensive backs? Does he focus more on tackling, more just pure coverage? It'll be really interesting to see how he evolves the defensive back position. And it'll be interesting to see who JMU brings in at the linebacker coach
Mhm.
position because Zach Sparber left to go to Rutgers as a co-defensive coordinator. According to sources, he was a leading candidate with Hitchler to be the defensive coordinator.
Mhm.
I wouldn't be shocked if he got news that Hitchler was going to be hired, and that's when he took the opportunity at Rutgers. But that leaves a pretty massive hole in the middle of the defense with the linebackers to replace as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this is sort of a question that I have. This is also kind of a stat that I'm just reading off. In 2023, JMU had one of the best defenses in the country. They allowed just 83.9 rushing yards per game, which was the fifth fewest in all of college football. And they allowed just 19.5 yards per game, which was the 20th best in the nation. And they had 45 total sacks, 13 interceptions. I think you get to the point. Their defense was amazing in 2023. And, they weren't bad in 2024, but they definitely failed to replicate that same success without Kurt Cignetti 1 year prior. On the other side of the spectrum, at Indiana, with Cignetti, they became one of the best defenses in the NCAA this past season. The Hoosiers allowed the 10th fewest passing yards per game, the fewest rushing yards per game, and the sixth fewest points per game. Do you think JMU will be able to find that same success that they had 2 years prior before Cignetti departed?
I think they had it last year. I mean, if you kind
Mm,
of look at it in certain ways, Cignetti and Brian Haynes, the defensive coordinator, they focused a lot on stopping the football, where
mhm,
Hemphill played a little bit more of an aggressive style of defense that valued turning the ball over and getting those opportunities. So it is kind of more of a high risk, high reward. But at the end of the day, the defense last year, I don't think you could point to really any game and say that the defense lost them any games. Same thing can be said about the
yeah,
2023 squad with Cignetti and Haynes. The numbers may not be as gaudy, as amazing as that 2023 unit was, but considering that they lost, 90% of their starters from that defense in 2023, you're replacing them all, new defensive coordinator. I think what Hemphill was able to do was really impressive, and they should be on the same trajectory this year. Do I expect the same turnover numbers? Not at all. Do I expect them to
yeah,
hold their opponents under 90 yards rushing per game like they did in 2023? No, but do
mm,
I expect them to hold opponents to 20 something points per game and give the offense opportunities to win them the games? 100%. And that's all you can ask a defense to do.
Yeah, and again, this defense wasn't bad last season. I
Yeah.
just think it's all in comparison to where they
Yeah.
were in 2023. This was one of, if not the best defense in the Sun Belt last year, but wasn't one of the best defenses in the nation. That's where it gets a little bit questionable, which is definitely an argument you could make about that 2023 squad. And Hitchler was fired by Alabama. I don't think it's anything to worry about. This was obviously Alabama's first season without Nick Saban, and they finished with a 9-4 record, missing the college football playoffs. It felt like Kalen DeBoer, their current head coach, knew he had to make some changes, which is why he did end up firing Hitchler. And, after all, Alabama's coaching staff was extremely crowded last season. They had a defensive coordinator as well as two co defensive coordinators, one of which was Hitchler. So I don't think if you're looking at it from the fact that he was hired, that's not really a great point to make. He's, been with 3 power schools in, his time as a coach. He has a lot of experience in general. Before we move on to the next part of this interview, this, podcast, is there anything else you want to say about that hiring?
I think it's going to be a really, really solid hire. He was my number one choice when I heard his name start to get floating around. And when they ended up landing him, I was very excited because I think he's going to do some big things with the defense this year.
Yeah, completely agree. Really excited to see how he does. And 5 days ago, it was announced that the Jacksonville Jaguars were interviewing JMU's offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, Dean Kennedy. If Kennedy does end up leaving for a position with the Jaguars, how will that affect this JMU offense next season?
I don't think it'll affect it that much.
Mhm.
I I I think Dean Kennedy is a really good young offensive coordinator with a lot of room to grow. I think he can be good. I think he got in his own way at times. I also think this last season, coordinating an offense with a quarterback who started the year red hot, got hurt midway through the year, and then you had to kind of manage that makes it very difficult. But at times, it felt like as fans watching the games, we were banging our heads against the wall, like that they were doing the same thing repeatedly and they were still getting no results. Um, I think Dean Kennedy, though, will be a very good offensive coordinator. He's a great offensive mind. He has some room to grow. If he takes the Jaguars job, I don't think that the offense though is going to take that big of a step back because I think Chris Smith, the current offensive line coach, is the next coordinator. I mean, he was the
Yeah.
coordinator for Chesney at Holy Cross, and then he left that position to become the New York Giants offensive line coach or assistant offensive line coach. and then Kennedy stepped in to become the offensive coordinator at Holy Cross. So if Dean Kennedy leaves, I think the offensive coordinator replacement is on the staff already, and I think he may even be maybe more mature within that role and could lead JMU's offense to more success in 2025.
Yeah, and JMU's starting quarterback last season, Alonzo Barnett the third. I know you just kind of touched on this. He limped off the field during the Duke's final offensive play against Marshall on November 30th. This injury kept Barnett from playing in the Boca Raton Bowl on
Mm-hmm.
December 18th. While we don't know what Barnett's injury status looks like, it doesn't seem to be great considering the fact that JMU recently brought in quarterbacks Camden Coleman and Matthew Sluka through the transfer portal. Who do you expect to be JMU's starter at the beginning of the season?
I'm a big Camden Coleman believer.
Mhm.
At ESPN Richmond, we broadcast all of the Richmond Spiders games,
Yeah.
football games and basketball games. But so I became kind of acquainted with Camden Coleman's game this last year, and he's a darn good quarterback. Some of his stats might not be as gaudy as the Sluka rushing attack or even the Barnett just passing yardage. But Coleman, when he got his opportunities to pass in a very run heavy offense, Camden Coleman excelled. He's young. He's a big body, so he can run the ball. He's not necessarily the fastest, but he has some athletic ability. I think he will be QB1. I don't think Alonzo Barnett will be ready to go for week one. So I'm under the assumption, and this is just from gut feeling, seeing that they bring in Sluka, they bring in Coleman,
Mhm.
um, just complete gut feeling is that they're going to use a medical red shirt on Barnett this year. That's all speculation. I have no inside source with that, but it just feels like that with
Mhm.
Sluka, Coleman coming in. I don't expect Barnett to be ready by week one. And if he's not ready by week one, I would not be shocked if they just shelved him and used a red shirt on him. Uh, and with that, I think you'll see Coleman. I think Coleman will be QB1.
Mhm. Yeah, now, when you look at Sluka, he's probably the biggest name for a quarterback that they got. If Chesney wants to go with that connection that he had with Sluka at Holy Cross, I wouldn't, be surprised to see
Yeah.
him as the starter. But then also, if they wanted this move to really benefit the wide receivers, Coleman played with Landon Ellis and Nick DeGennaro, both at Richmond. So they're now Dukes. I also wouldn't be surprised if they want to put Coleman with his former teammates, keep that connection. And you said that Barnett probably won't start the season, at least in your eyes. If he does manage to start, would you rather, or if he does manage to make a full recovery, I should say, would you
Yeah.
rather see him in there?
I would want to see whoever wins the quarterback battle. I would trust the coaches to make the right decision on the quarterback battle. And whoever comes out of that as the winner is who I'd be comfortable with as a fan to be QB1. The issue is I don't know when Barnett, I don't like you said earlier, we don't know what his
Yeah.
injury is. We don't know the severity of it. We don't know so much around it. He could be ready by the start of fall camp. We just don't know. But there's also a real possibility that he may not be ready to go in football, like actual football practice, until the third week of fall camp. And if that's the case, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that because I think Barnett is a very talented young quarterback. I think he needs the live reps. I think he needs the experience. He got that this year, but I think he needs more of it. And the offseason would have been great for him to get those. I just don't think he'll be cleared for football activity until maybe middle of August. And if by then you just lost out on 7 months of preparation.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a really unclear situation. As you
Yes.
mentioned, we don't know the injury. We don't know what his status is. There's a lot that we don't know about that we're going to have to wait on. Now, another quarterback that I want to highlight is, JC Evans, who was a true freshman last season with the Dukes in the Boca Raton Bowl. Evans, of course, this was without Barnett. Billy Atkins was the starter, but Evans still had 64 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. However, he completed just one pass all season long, the 1-yard touchdown in the Boca Raton Bowl. Evans, he hasn't had much of a chance to prove himself, and he obviously won't be the starter next season. But do you expect JMU to still try and incorporate him in the offense in any way possible?
If they have Sluka, no.
Mhm.
Uh, JC Evans, he got a red shirt last year. He didn't play. I think he played in 3 regular season games. He didn't play in the enough to burn his red shirt. So he gets to keep his red shirt. So he'll go into this year as a red shirt freshman. I don't see him being used all that often. Um, I know some fans absolutely love him. He's electric. He's fun. He's a big guy. Uh, we would always joke around that like the packages they had for him were JC run right, JC run left, and it wasn't much more than just run straight ahead into the line of scrimmage. And if you hit a hole, you hit a hole. If not, you just gain 4 yards because you're so tall
Yeah.
you could essentially fall forward. Um, with that being said, Sluka would be the running quarterback, and I don't think they would bring JC in to just to run it like they did in the Boca Raton Bowl. I thought that was a very special case, and I don't foresee that happening a ton in 2025.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Evans' height. He's 6'5", kind of showed similarities running to like a Josh Allen, Anthony Richardson, in the Boca Raton Bowl. So you said that you don't really expect them to do any design runs, I guess, where they just bring him in occasionally, a designed run. They take him in, or they put him in. He runs it, take him out, kind of like a Taysom Hill, I guess.
Yeah,
Taysom Hill in the NFL. You don't see that happening.
I don't. Mainly
Mhm.
because I think Sluka will get the lion's share of those opportunities if they end up doing a package like that. I think there's a reason why they brought Sluka in, and that's probably going to be the reason.
Yeah, and JMU obviously made a splash in the transfer portal, bringing in a bunch of new names. Who's one transfer portal addition that you're most excited to watch this upcoming season?
I'm this is a kind of off the beaten path one, but the
Mhm.
Division II linebacker from Shepherd, JT Kwame Yao,
Yeah. Mhm.
could be a really fun
Yeah.
addition. Dude, we talked with him over on Jamie Sports News. Dude he just learned the sport of football a few years ago and he's
Yeah.
still learning it. And he's so athletic that he can really, I think, become a menace in the Sun Belt with now Cullen Hitchler as his defensive coordinator.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see what JT Kwame Yao does. And you had him on this podcast I think a week ago or so. Not Kyrie Mans,
Xavier Holmes.
Xavier Holmes. Thank
Yes.
you. He's going to have the type of
Yeah.
season that Kyrie Mans had.
Mhm.
Xavier Holmes is a dog, balled out at Maine. I have high expectations for Xavier Holmes.
Yeah, and Holmes and Mans were actually teammates at Maine.
Exactly.
But yeah, I'm really excited to see him. He was one of the more productive defensive players JMU added. In terms of the offensive side, I think DeGennaro, specifically based on stats, looked amazing, and if they
Yeah.
do end up rolling with Coleman, that's an extra connection. I think Jalen Sanchez from Villanova also looked really solid. He's a big guy. He was really productive last season. So those are just a few names that I'm especially interested in.
Yeah.
And, there are also so many star players that recently left the Dukes, including Eric O'Neal to Rutgers, Kyrie Mans, Terrence Spence, Jacob Dobbs, Taylor Thompson, and Amarian Dollison, who graduated. Do you think JMU did a good enough job filling these gaps?
I do. I think it'll be tough. I mean, it's always tough to replace, an Eric O'Neal type
Mm.
of
Yeah.
production, but they just had to do that a few years ago. So uh, I think with Jalen Green, he left all of those sacks left with him,
Mhm.
and you kind of replaced him in the aggregate. And Eric O'Neal just happened to absolutely burst onto the scene. I think they've done enough. I think they had a lot more time. And if you look back at the transfer class from 2023 going into 2024, some of the guys that popped, the Eric O'Neals, an LIU guy from the Northeast Conference of the FCS. That's not even a good FCS conference. He pops. They did their scouting on him, and he was excellent. Terrence Spence came over from Holy Cross. Granted, they knew who he was because of
Yeah.
them coaching him at Holy Cross, but another guy who absolutely popped. Jesse Ramiel, now at Mississippi State, another St. Francis low end FCS guy who comes over and is a star left tackle, was one of the kind of anchors of that offensive
Mhm.
line. These are all low level guys. And I don't mean that in talent, I mean that in the conferences they were
Yeah.
playing in that come over and they absolutely they ball out and they become these huge fan favorite names. They had opportunities now. They had a whole offseason to scout and to figure out what low level conferences they can go to. JT Kwame Yao from the Division II ranks. Moala, I can never get his name right, but the
Yeah.
offensive lineman from Valdosta State, Division II powerhouse, he comes over. He could be a huge contributor. Zach Greenberg started his career at the Division III level, played a year at UNC, but he comes over. There's a lot of guys that may not have, next to their name, the, Wisconsin transfer, the Alabama transfer. They didn't come from a Power Five or a Power Four. They're coming from FCS Division II. But I think those are the guys that are going to have the biggest impacts next
Mhm.
year because sometimes the Power Four transfers are the highest risks, highest rewards, and we saw that kind of bear out last season.
Yeah, and if there's one player I think has a really high upside in that same category, it'd be Zeron Collins from
Yeah,
Tusculum. I don't know how much Zeron Collins is actually going to do this season because JMU really loaded up the wide receiver position. He only had 10 catches, but averaged over 22 yards last season, has multiple years of eligibility left, a lot of speed, deep ball threat, kind of shows similarities to an Amarian Dollison. So I think, I expect him to really grow
yeah.
throughout his time at JMU. Now, I do have a slightly more interesting question to ask before we do wrap things up. Who do you think the next NFL player is coming from the Dukes? Is it someone who already declared for the draft, a
Ooh,
Jacob Dobbs, Kyrie Mann, someone on the roster, or maybe someone who's either not on the team, not even in college yet? Who's the next Dukes player to make the NFL?
so coming into this season, I would say I have to pull up the roster to kind of scroll through and see the
Mhm.
names here
Yeah.
because I was
They
thinking before the season began that Ryan Hansen could be the next,
yeah.
NFL guy. It may honestly be Ruella's, the
Mhm.
current kicker.
Yeah.
Those positional special teamers probably have the best chance of becoming
Mhm.
NFLers. Potentially Jesse Ramil as well. I know 1 year at JMU, then he's going to finish out at Mississippi State. But if he balls out at Mississippi State, he could potentially be the next guy. Um, Kyrie Mans, maybe. Jacob Dobbs, maybe. I'm not entirely sure on those guys because it's just kind of hard to break through in those spots. But Ruella's probably is the next like biggest chance because dude's got a huge leg, great accuracy. If he can maintain health, um, I think he'll be the next NFL player. It's kind of scrolling through some other
Mhm.
guys,
Yeah.
potentially George Pettaway. I
Mhm.
don't think Io Adei has a chance. I think he's just kind of old and has been kind of beaten up. So could see George Pettaway though. Ruella's that's probably it off the top of my
Mhm.
head.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to focus on two that you said, Jacob Dobbs and Kyrie Mans. I had both of them on the podcast actually, and I'm rooting for them, but I also do have concerns. Kyrie Mans, I think his, biggest case could be the fact that he played at Colorado under Deion Sanders. I don't know if he got enough playing time there, though. I don't know if they could say, you know, we saw him really thrive against good competition because he didn't play that much against good competition. He didn't play that much in general at Colorado. Looked great with JMU last season. It's how much you value this last season, though. And then Jacob Dobbs. My biggest concern with him is the fact that he spent 6 seasons in college, 5 at Holy Cross, his last one at JMU. He's extremely talented. One of JMU's most productive defensive players last year, either him or Eric O'Neill. But, that's also really dependent on age. And I don't know if teams are going to want to take a chance on someone who spent 6 years in college,
Yeah.
is my only concern.
O'Neal as well, another kind of 1 year
Mhm.
guy at
Yeah.
JMU, but going to Rutgers, he can ball out. He could be an NFL draft
Mhm.
pick. Mans has the versatility, I think, to potentially make an
Mhm.
NFL roster because he's a
Yeah.
guy who can play linebacker. He's a guy that played edge. He was kind of that Swiss Army knife in Lyle Hempel's
Mhm.
defense this last year. Whenever you would watch the game, sometimes he's lining up as a traditional linebacker, other times he's on the edge. So his versatility could help him land on an NFL roster. But it's just so tough to make NFL
Yeah.
rosters.
Yeah. And, I do have one final question to ask before we wrap things up. If there was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring sports broadcaster and journalist like me, what would it be?
It would be just do it, and I mean, you're doing it with this podcast, and it's things like that, like JMU Sports News. We
Mhm.
just did it. You do it, and you keep with it. You continue doing it, and just kind of something that I live by too is sometimes like I I don't know any better. Like I'm too stupid to know any better. So just kind of do it and do it until you're told no, and
Mhm.
stick with it. Those are probably the biggest pieces of advice.
Yeah, and with that being said, really appreciate the advice. Can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up?
You can just find all of my content, all the JMU Sports News content at JMU Sports News on Twitter, on X. You can follow me at FITZ all the way and catch me on the airwaves every day on 1061 ESPN Richmond.
Yeah, and if you made it up to this point, if you're watching, make sure you like and subscribe. Again, I'm Matthew Heiserman alongside Jack Fitzpatrick for your 38th ever Highlight Haven interview. And as always, we will see you next time.